What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary?
What's stopping you?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
Where is purgatory in the Bible?
What's stopping you?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. It is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. Those of you who have questions about the Catholic faith, maybe you don't know who to turn to get those answers. We are here for you. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response, and then when you get that, text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. Those of you watching us on TV today, best way for you to contact the show is through email, ctc@ewtn.com. All right, Pedro Quiles, our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener, and Rich Jesse handling social media. If you'd like to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we're streaming on both those platforms today. All you have to do is put your question in the comments box. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I am well. How are you, sir?
I'm doing decent, thank you.
Interesting question from George to lead things off today. Does it matter whether some of the Old Testament figures like Moses existed historically, or if they're just stories to teach a lesson?
Yeah, thanks. So does it matter? Well, I think there are some figures from the Old Testament whose historical existence is beyond a doubt, right?
Yeah.
In particular, the Davidic monarchy, right? I mean, it's really beyond a doubt. It's the framework within which the Old Testament canon came together around the idea of the nation state of Israel, the facts surrounding the exile. I mean, these are the essential context to make sense of Second Temple Judaism in the time of Christ, right?
Uh-huh.
But some of the other figures that sort of vanish into legend and story, I think of someone like the character of Job in the book of Job. And, when I go back and read Gregory's Morale on Job, it seems evident to me that Pope Gregory thinks that Job was an historical person. But Catholics have taken that position. That's not a magisterial doctrine. It's not something that Catholics are bound to believe, but Catholics have held that opinion through the centuries. But it strikes me as something that is really immaterial to the message of the book, which is essentially a kind of theodicy, how to think about God in the midst of suffering. And, that's about our spiritual orientation towards our existential condition, suffering, God, faith.
Yeah.
And whether there's an historical Job or not much seems to hang on that. Now, what I'm not going to do is go through every Old Testament character and tell you how theologically significant I think his historical existence is.
Oh,
right?
Good.
But I will say that the Catholic Church has always held that whatever the history is,
Yes.
that the significance of the text for us lies beyond the mere history, the mere historical sense of the text, in what we call the spiritual sense of the text. This is the use of the text to unite us to Christ, to change our character. And so, historians can quibble about the facts, but if they leave me untransformed,
Yeah.
it doesn't really matter if I have established beyond a shadow of a doubt that, Moses came down from Mount Sinai with 2 tablets, if I don't obey the 2 tablets, right? The important thing is actually not committing murder, not committing adultery, not worshiping other gods. If I've done those things, then I'm spiritually transformed, regardless of, what kind of rock the 2 tablets was carved out of. That's maybe an interesting historical question, but of very little relevance for my life.
Yeah, for sure. And George, thanks so much for your email. Here's one now from Annette. Were other disciples present at the Last Supper besides the 12 apostles?
That's a really good question. And of course, the text is silent on that. It does seem to have been an intimate group, right? It does seem to have been an intimate group. And of course, we don't know all the details. We don't know if Judas even made it to the point of the consecration. We know he split at some point during the day. We don't know exactly when he split, right? But it's, the church's tradition has always understood this text not only as institution of the Eucharist, but the institution of the office of the priesthood. And so the 12 have a preeminent role at the table, right? That's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Annette, thanks for your email as well. Here's one from Bell. Is a baptism only in the name of Jesus significantly different from a Catholic baptism?
Yes, it's not a baptism. Right? It's not valid if it's not in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's the formula that Christ gave us. And if you make up some other formula, then it isn't what Christ gave us. And so it's not what the church means by baptism, and the church would not regard it as valid.
Very good. And this one from Marco. Which tribes did the apostles come from?
Well, we don't know all of those tribes.
Okay.
But presumably, most of them would have been from the tribe of Judah because they lived in Judea, right? Matthew also called Levi. There's kind of a clue there. Maybe he was a Levite. Of course, the Apostle Paul was a Benjamite, right? But probably mostly from the tribe of Judah. Maybe a Levite thrown in there, maybe a Benjamite, but mostly from the tribe of Judah, just based on the geography.
Sure. All right. And Marco, thanks so much for your email. Thanks for all these great emails. If you would like to send us an email for a future show, here is the address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. We try to hit a couple of emails on each of our live shows, and then once a month or so, we'll dip into the mailbag and do a whole passel of emails, and we can get caught up that way. Again, the address, ctc@ewtn.com. In a moment, we're going to get to the phones. We'll begin with Aldo in Wisconsin. He is standing by. We have some lines open for you right now. 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, maybe you'd like to explain to us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic. 833-288-3986 is that phone number. Or if you prefer, text the letters EWTN to 58177. Back in a moment with lots more Call to Communion here on EWTN. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. One of the great platforms that we are blessed to be on is the Roku platform. Roku allows you to instantly stream EWTN to your TV set. All you need is a high-speed internet connection, a TV, and the Roku player. For more information, visit EWTN.com/Roku. Very blessed to be partnering with Roku for a number of years now. All right, if you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN, beginning with Aldo in Wisconsin, listening on the EWTN app. Hey, Waldo. Aldo, what's on your mind today?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go right ahead, Aldo.
Okay, sure. By the way, I get that Waldo joke a lot, so don't worry.
Oh, sorry about that.
You're good. So my question is, in the time of the popes faring off against the kings, there were a lot of excommunications, indulgences, annulments swung around, or not given, and sometimes for political reasons or for personal gain and that kind of thing. And so I wonder what we kind of make of that, because, I mean, these have immense spiritual ramifications, and I guess, do we consider some of those to have been invalid, especially as it relates to the early Protestant criticisms or concerns about the church? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So the church as a society, has to have a governmental organization to manage its internal affairs, and so it must have laws. And this is true of any organization at any scale, right? I mean, all the way down to the 8-year-olds in the neighborhood that have a secret club, right? And the policy is you can't get into the clubhouse without the password, right?
That's right.
Everybody has got some set of principles and rules by which they organize themselves. They may not always be written down. Sometimes they're oral. They may change by consensus immediately, as in the case of the 8-year-olds. Okay, we remit the rule in this case, right? Or because Sally has cookies, so she gets in on
That's
the cookie
right.
exception. But but there's still a principle there of organization. Every Baptist church has one. Every Presbyterian church has one. The Catholic Church, because of its scope, its scale, its size, its age, obviously has a more complicated legal code, but it's not essentially different from any other organization in having a code. Now, the possibility exists that the code can be misapplied because the people who are responsible for enforcing it are human beings who can have various motivations and they can have poor judgment and so forth. You talked about the serious spiritual ramifications that flow from excommunication, and here I'm going to have to qualify that remark, because it is not the position of the Catholic Church that the excommunicate is somehow cut off from the grace of God. That's not the teaching of the Catholic Church. It is, however, interestingly, the teaching of John Calvin, right? So within the Calvinist Church, the Protestant Reformed Church, Calvin wielded his own version of excommunication in his Reformed Church in Geneva. He wielded it rather vigorously, and at one time, something like 1 out of 20 people in Geneva was excommunicated by Calvin. It was a very high percentage,
Jay.
right? Yeah, he really used it rather vigorously in the 1550s. William Monter, who's a historian, has done some work on excommunication in Calvin's Geneva. That's where I'm pulling that number from. And he actually did think that if you're excommunicated, you were outside of redemption. But that's not the Catholic view, right? And so an excommunication can be valid, but have no spiritual effect whatsoever at all on the soul of the excommunicated person, right? So a person can be falsely accused, right? Let's say I'm accused of, some sort of crime against the Pope, for example,
Yeah.
and I'm actually innocent, right? But maybe, somebody bears false witness against me. So the church imposes this excommunication. Well, I mean, God knows my heart. And church theology, even going all the way back into the Middle Ages, Innocent III talks about this explicitly, is that, I'm not cut off from the grace of God. Now, out of deference to the church and its authority, and for the sake of good public order, I have to behave like an excommunicated person.
Right.
So I'm going to refrain from any exercise of any kind of office I have in the church or from the use of the sacraments. But it's at no disadvantage to my spiritual life. In fact, it might actually be salvific in my case because of my humility.
Yeah.
Right, my submitting to my act of obedience, my humble submission to the authority of the church, all these things could be occasions of merit rather than of a penal sanction in my case, if I am in fact innocent. There are also some pretty strict rules that govern, that would be an excommunication that's valid but has no spiritual effect. There can also be an invalid excommunication. Excommunications have to follow a certain formula, and there could be defects in the actual imposition juridically that could arise at the level of the motive of the one giving it. Now, I'm not an expert in that area of the law; it's pretty technical stuff. But again, would have no spiritual effect in the individual soul. So it's really not an issue, right? Now, you talked about this being a sort of profligate use of excommunications, and you threw in indulgences and annulments. And I'm not sure why, except that these are legal decisions by the church. As to whether indulgences were thrown around profligately, I don't think indulgences were thrown around profligately. I think that indulgences could be abused. They were abused in the Reformation era. The origin of indulgences is actually from the laity. It's not from the hierarchy. It was the laity that appealed to the church for the blessing of indulgences, and the church agreed with the spiritual logic of it. And so you would substitute a greater penance, with a lesser penance. Well, one of the traditional penances that people perform is to give alms. Well, you see, and that's innocuous. I mean, that's actually meritorious. Jesus says, if you give alms in secret, your Father who sees you in secret will reward you. So there's nothing wrong with giving alms. It's good to give alms.
Yeah.
But if you're the person who is, remitting the temporal punishment due to sin, and you direct where the alms are meant to go, well, the possibility of abuse creeps in pretty obviously, and that's what happened in the 16th century, and that occasioned Luther's 95 Theses, and the Church has rectified that, said we don't do that part of it anymore. But as far as the spiritual efficacy of indulgences, I don't think they were affected. Right? Just because the authority misuses it for his own gain doesn't mean that the penitent isn't actually gaining an actual legitimate indulgence. And as to whether annulments were used profligately, I think it was the Church's refusal to use annulments profligately that prompted the Reformation in England. Henry VIII wanted an annulment, and the Pope wouldn't give him one, and therefore he split off and formed his own church.
Yeah. And Aldo, thank you so much for your call. Glad you're checking in from Wisconsin today. And that opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion here on EWTN. This email now from George. Could a Mormon and a Catholic be married?
Oh, sure. Yeah, they absolutely could. So a Catholic is permitted to marry a non-Catholic. He or she is encouraged not to.
Yeah. Right?
And so if you marry a non-Catholic, you have to get a dispensation from your bishop. And you still have to follow canonical form for marriage, or you have to receive a dispensation from canonical form. Now, here are where the complications would come. I am certainly no expert in Mormon rites of marriage. But I know that Mormons are pretty particular about marriage because it's very integral to their view of redemption. And if I'm correct on this, and if you're Mormons out there listening to me, you can correct me, but I think there's more than one type of marriage ceremony in the LDS Church. There are some that take place in the so-called Mormon temples, and they require a certain degree of elite status to gain that, as it were, blessing. Uh-huh. And they're replete with Mormon imagery that relate to the Mormon doctrine of salvation in the afterlife. I think a Catholic would have a very hard time participating in one of those kinds of rites. In fact, I don't know enough about Mormonism, but I doubt the Mormons would let them, right? And so you wouldn't get a dispensation from a Catholic bishop that would allow you to do that sort of thing. But provided the Mormon in the party would agree to the Catholic canonical rites of marriage, there would be no objection on the part of the Church to a Catholic marrying a Mormon, provided it was according to canonical form.
George, thanks so much for your email. Back to the phones now at 833-288-EWTN. Here is John in Cincinnati, listening on the Great Sacred Heart Radio, AM 740. Hey, John, what's on your mind today, sir?
Well, thanks for taking my call. I just have two little kind of cultural things that I'm having personal difficulties with. Nothing really serious internally, but the first is with the new Pope on board. In America, we seem to the discussions. If you want to pay attention to the news, the discussion seems to turn toward people wanting to fit him into our absurd political paradigms of our culture because he's American and. How do you think we get past this? How do we say, hey, the church is different than politics, and it's beyond that, right? And then kind of the second little thing I have today, I saw the news that they've put the body of St. Teresa on display. And as a Catholic, I guess, is it okay that bothers me a little bit? I'm kind of personally don't kind of see the point, but I don't know. It's okay that I struggle with it.
Sure. I really appreciate it. So as far as politicizing the Pope or trying to read him through the lens of secular ideology, I think that has always happened and will always continue to happen for those whose primary paradigm for interpreting reality is their political ideology, right? If that's what's important to you, then it doesn't matter if it's a new Pope or a new baseball team or a new president or, a new electric co-op in the neighborhood. Like your concern is, how is this going to affect me and my ideology? And so you're never going to get away from that. Now, hopefully, if we're Catholics and we're sincere about our faith, then political ideology is not going to be our principal framework for interpreting reality. It may be there in the background, and I think it probably is for everybody. I'm a Catholic, and I have my political preferences about how I want my country to be run. And so I'd be marginally interested in how anybody, Pope or otherwise, might affect what I'd like to see play out in the country.
Sure.
I'm sufficiently well catechized as a Catholic to know that that's not the Pope's job description. His job description is not to further my political agenda. It is, in fact, to further Christ's theological agenda. And I hopefully would be mature enough to evaluate the Pope on that basis.
Sure.
Right? But that's a matter of, my own personal formation and hopefully my virtue. And so, the way forward there is the long, tried and true, but difficult, plodding process of catechizing the faithful and encouraging them to live a holy life.
Yes, indeed. What about the idea of displaying a saint's remains?
Oh, yeah, thanks. So the practice of venerating the dead bodies of the saints goes back to before the New Testament. It goes back into Second Temple Judaism.
Wow.
Actually goes back before Second Temple Judaism. I mean, Judahite burial practices and the veneration of the dead in one form or another goes back, at least to the 8th century BC and maybe even earlier, probably earlier. So it's really very deeply embedded in Israel's history and in the biblical narrative and in the New Testament church, and it's been part of the tradition forever, essentially, right?
Yeah.
But in particular, after the ascension of Christ and the doctrine that through baptism we become members of his body, St. Gregory of Nyssa put the significance of it this way. He said, we venerate Christ in his members. And so as I venerate the body of a saint, I really am bearing witness to my belief that this body belongs to Jesus, and it will be raised again on the last day as Christ is the first fruits of our very own redemption, right? And so it's a kind of wonderful testament to our belief, first in the intercessory power of the saint, but also in the doctrine that all of us through baptism become members of Christ's body, right? So it's if you understand the theological rationale, I think you can see some beauty in it. I know I do, and I used to find it quite kind of sickening, honestly, before I was Catholic.
Really?
When I would see the veneration of saints and their relics, I got kind of the cooties about it. Thought, ooh, that's kind of gross, kind of morbid. But as I learned more about it, I became much more positively inclined towards it. I think it's quite normal to think it's a little bit strange. Honestly, I don't think that's off. And if you find yourself kind of squeamish in the presence of a cadaver, I think that's a fairly normal human response. So I don't think anything wrong with that at the sort of gut level, but understanding the theological rationale can help.
John, thanks so much for your call today from Cincinnati. Call to communion here on EWTN. Will in Tallahassee wrote to us. We took a question earlier about Mormons. How much would the Church of Latter-day Saints hypothetically have to reform in order for the Catholic Church to recognize its baptisms?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I don't see that happening. I really don't. I mean, it's kind of like asking how much. It's not quite the same, but it'd be a little bit like asking, how much would Judaism have to change to become Christianity?
Ugh.
Or how much would Islam have to change to become Christianity, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a nonsensical question because they're fundamentally different religious traditions, right?
Sure.
And that's the Church's position on Mormonism, is that it's fundamentally a different religious tradition. It has they use a lot of the same names. I mean, just like Islam. Islam talks about Jesus and Mary and, the saints in the Old Testament. They use a lot of the same terminology, but they don't invest those with anything like the same significance. Mm-hmm. I mean, Jesus to a Muslim is not the same thing as Jesus to a Catholic. Same thing's true of Mormonism. Jesus to a Mormon is not the same person as Jesus to a Catholic. I mean, they're fundamentally different. God, the meaning of the word God to an LDS member, it does not mean the same thing that it means to a Catholic.
So for a baptism...
And so the reason Mormon baptism is invalid is that the whole religious system is something other than historic Christianity.
Okay.
Right? So Mormonism would have to cease being Mormonism. And, we're not asking Mormons to stop being Mormons. We're trying to present the truth of Christ, and whosoever wills will come.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we do.
That's what we do on this show and on this network. Will in Tallahassee, Alabama. Thanks so much for your question. In a moment, David in Texas, Kevin in Western New York. Lots more straight ahead on this edition of Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Do stay with us. Thanks for joining us here on Call to Communion on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-EWTN. 833-288-3986. Congratulations going out to another great EWTN radio partner, AM 1260, The Rock. That is in Cleveland. They are celebrating 10 years with EWTN. Congratulations to Marianne Mayteam and her great team there in Cleveland from your friends here at EWTN. All right, back to it now for line one. David, a first-time caller in Texas, listening on the great Guadalupe radio. Hey, David, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hey, good afternoon, gentlemen.
Howdy.
Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I have a child who was baptized Catholic long ago, left the Catholic Church for various reasons. He's an adult now, is attending a non-denominational church here in the area, and has an upcoming adult baptism in that church. The fact that I do not wish to attend causing a little friction in the family. So I was concerned, what is the official position of the Catholic Church on this?
Yeah, thanks. So the church would not forbid your attendance. The church would regard this as an invalid sacrament because the person cannot validly receive the sacrament a second time. He's already received it validly the first time, can't validly receive it a second time, so it's not a valid baptism. And it, it's kind of it's sort of a de facto renunciation of his Catholic baptism, right, which is tragic and sad. So I can understand your hesitance about going, but you're not forbidden to go by the church. And I think it's a prudential decision on your part about, if it's a question of conscience, like I cannot in conscience go, well, then I would tell you to obey your conscience. If your concern is, well, I don't want to send the wrong message, I'm worried about the sin of scandal. I don't want people to think that I'm okay with this. Well, you could do this. You could say, I'm not okay with this, but I love you, and I understand that this is important to you, and so I'm going to be there because you've asked me to, and I care about you, and I want to know. I want you to know that I'm encouraging you in your relationship with God, even though, I think it's a mistake to leave the Catholic Church. I'd rather you have a faith in God than otherwise, and so I'm going to be there for you. But I'm not okay with the baptism as such because I think you were already baptized. But hey, you're you do me, and I'll do me, and we'll get along as adults, but that's where I stand. You could do that, and then that would remove that question of scandal.
Yeah.
But if it's a matter of conscience, then I'd tell you to obey your conscience.
David, thanks so much for your call. Lines are open for you right now at 833-288-EWTN, 833-288-3986, or you can text the letters EWTN to 58177. Kevin is in Western New York listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Kevin, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. Andrews. It's a pleasure to speak with both you and Tom. And, Doctor, this is not my first time calling because you've helped me before, and I really appreciate it. The reason I'm calling is I have a friend at the gym who's a very dedicated Protestant. He's a great guy, a really nice man, but he's very, very focused on Protestantism, a bit of a preacher on the floor of the gym. Anyway, he told me the other day that he finds St. Augustine to be the origins of Calvinism, to have the origins of Calvinism, where he thinks that the church went astray under the thinking of Thomas Aquinas later. And not being fairly ignorant myself, I figured I would just go to somebody who's an expert, and that's you. I would like to know better. Do you have any idea what exactly he's talking about? I don't know. I know there's a variety of possibilities.
I do know what he's talking about. And he's mixing up several different themes in Protestant historiography, and I think he's displaying his ignorance, quite frankly. So it has long been the Protestant contention that the Catholic Church, that Augustine was their guy, right? Yeah. And they're always trying to ground their teaching in Augustine, and that the Catholic Church got off the rails after Augustine. Now, there's another set of criticisms that Protestants will have of Catholicism where they criticize Aquinas. But it's usually not in the same breath here, right? And the reason I say that is because anybody who's actually bothered to read Aquinas understands that Aquinas and Augustine have virtually the same doctrine of redemption. I mean, it's indistinguishable. And in fact, there's a celebrated school of ecumenical Catholic Reformation historiography that maintains that if only Luther had read Aquinas, he wouldn't have left the church, because he would have understood that Aquinas and Augustine agree on justification, right? So that I think that your fellow is confused when he points to Augustine on the one hand and then suggests that there's some sort of cleavage with Aquinas. Usually, people who want to talk about departing from Augustine, if you're an informed Protestant, you're going to argue that the break comes later than Aquinas. You're going to argue that it comes, after Scotus and Occam, and in particular in 15th century Catholic nominalism, right? So Gabriel Biel, for example, is a Catholic scholastic philosopher who was a nominalist, and Luther is sort of famously indebted to Biel for his early understanding of the doctrine of redemption. And it's really from Biel that he breaks, not from Aquinas, who he didn't know very well. So I just think the guy doesn't know much about Reformation historiography. But as far as Augustine being a Calvinist, well, I mean, again, no one can say that with a straight face. If they've read Augustine, they've read Calvin, right? The points of commonality are that they use some of the same vocabulary. So Augustine and Calvin will both talk about justification, for example. But they manifestly don't mean the same thing by the word, right? They'll both talk about predestination. But they don't mean the same thing by the word, right? And, Augustine does have a very strong doctrine of predestination, of God's determining grace. So does Calvin. But, just to have some point of commonality doesn't make him a Calvinist. I mean, Augustine believes in God. Well, so did Calvin, right? That doesn't make Augustine a Calvinist, right?
Right.
Augustine was a biped, right? So was Calvin. That doesn't make him a Calvinist, right? And the points of difference are profound. So some points of difference between Augustine and Calvin that are really determinative here. Fundamentally, Augustine thinks that justification is the process whereby we are morally changed, and that it happens through God's grace, of course, but that through God's grace we're morally transformed so that God can regard us as righteous because we are in fact righteous. We've moved from unrighteousness to righteousness because we've moved from actually sinning to not sinning anymore, right? That is not what Calvin believed about redemption. Calvin thinks that justification is an imputation of Christ's righteousness, a forensic declaration whereby God declares us innocent even though we remain morally compromised intrinsically, right? Luther's metaphor of a dunghill covered in snow, that's the idea in Protestant forensic justification. Augustine absolutely did not believe that, absolutely not. And Luther and Calvin understood that, by the way. And Calvin believes in double predestination, that God chooses individuals to damn before the foundation of the world for the specific purpose of damning them, and that's not Augustine's doctrine of justification. Later Calvinists, of course, will go on to affirm the doctrine of limited atonement, the idea that Christ only died for the elect and not for the whole world. Augustine doesn't believe that. Calvin believed in the doctrine of irresistible grace. Augustine does not believe in irresistible grace. He thinks grace can be resisted. Both of them talk about a doctrine of the perseverance of the saints, but again, they mean manifestly different things by that. For Calvin, the perseverance of the saints means that if you are regenerate, if you're born again of the Spirit, you will necessarily persevere unto eternal life, right? That's the Calvinist position. Augustine's doctrine of perseverance is that you can be regenerate and still go to hell, and that you must pray for the grace of perseverance. Like, in order to be saved, you must persevere, and it's not a given that you'll persevere, right?
Sure.
That's pretty much the opposite of what Calvin says. So very different doctrines of perseverance. Calvin believes, and especially his heirs in 17th century Calvinism, that a person can know with certainty that he is elect. And neither Augustine nor Luther think that. Right. So, I mean, on so many points, they're different. On so many points, they're different. And then not to mention ecclesiology and sacramentology and the doctrine of church authority and the nature of Scripture and tradition. I mean, on so many points, they're different. So where does this idea come from that Augustine is somehow the source of Reformation doctrine? Well, here's where it comes from. Going back to the 15th century, within 15th century nominalist thought in the doctrine of justification was the idea that a Catholic idea that you have to cooperate with grace in order for it to be effective in your life. And so the question comes up, it's a pastoral question, how do I know I've cooperated? How do I know I've cooperated? And the formula that Beale and others used was facere quod in se est. Do what's in you, and then God will make up the difference, all right? Now, Luther, being a person of tender and scrupulous conscience, started obsessing over the question, how do I know I've done what's in me? Like, how do I know I've really given it my all? And he became very neurotic about it, right? And so he became very attentive to sort of every little fault, every little peccadillo in his moral life, and became obsessive about it, and ultimately totally destroyed his peace, right? And then he had a moment when he was reading Augustine's book De Spiritu et Littera, On the Spirit and the Letter, where Augustine lays out the idea that the law itself is impotent to change us morally, which is true, right? And that you have to have God's grace that changes you interiorly. And it was on the occasion of reading that letter that Luther has a sort of transformation of consciousness and says, oh, the law is impotent to change me. It has to be God's grace. On that much he agreed with Augustine, but he takes it farther than that and says that ultimately it's just God's act of forgiveness. It's not the moral change itself. And so any kind of moral effort or striving, Luther rejects as a part of justification. Augustine never said that. But because he's integral to Luther's biography, and he contrasts with the pastoral style of Gabriel Beale and the 15th century nominalists, he was important in the evolution of Luther's thought, but you cannot actually find Lutheranism in the early Augustine or the middle Augustine or the late Augustine. So my own path to Catholicism was precisely down this road, that I had been brought up to think that Augustine was our guy as a Calvinist. And then I started reading monumental amounts of Augustine. I just read thousands and thousands of pages of Augustine, and I came to the very discouraging and disheartening realization that, oh my gosh, Augustine was Catholic, right? That he was not a reformer. And it wasn't only I who came to this judgment. So I would like to point you and your friend at the gym to the work of Alistair McGrath, who is a Protestant. He is an evangelical Protestant. He is one of the most prominent Protestant historians writing in English today, and he has written probably the definitive work on the history of the doctrine of justification in the English language. And it's called Justitia Dei, which is a Latin title, but the book's in English. It's a 2-volume work. And McGrath, who's not a Catholic, he's a Protestant, he's an evangelical, freely admits that Luther's understanding of justification is a complete theological novelty with no precedent in 1,500 years of Catholic tradition, including in the works of Augustine, right? And he did not get it out of Augustine. And that's the conclusion of like major Protestant historians of dogma, not just me. Now, how you deal with that, is there are other questions about, how would you as a Protestant assimilate that data? But no, Augustine is not a proto-Calvinist.
All right. And Kevin, thanks so much for your call. We hope that's helpful for you and for your friend as well. Call to Communion here on EWTN. We'll get to as many calls as we can here. Here is Lawrence now. Lawrence is in North Carolina, listening to us on iHeartRadio today. Lawrence, what's on your mind? Hey, Lawrence.
Yes, Mr. Anders. My question is, why does the church have a social doctrine? I don't see any reference to either economic or social justice in all the readings covered by both the lectionaries, that is the daily and the Sunday lectionaries. So it does. So I think that this is outside the teaching of the faith, if you will, or it's outside the deposit of faith that we have received.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I really appreciate the question. So I'm first of all, I'm surprised that you would come to the conclusion that social justice as a concept is not reflected in the lectionary, because it makes me wonder if you have read the Old Testament prophets. Because the Old Testament prophets, it seems to me, are concerned with almost nothing else other than the question of social justice, the care for the poor, the distribution of goods. These kinds of themes are constant in the prophets. They basically have two targets, right, that they admonish. One is idolatry, and the other one is acts of social injustice. Now, they don't use the term social justice, right? But they're essentially targeting acts that are injustices of the social order, right? So I do think it's actually reflected in the lectionary. It's also clearly reflected in the writing of the Church Fathers. I mean, you find in someone like Chrysostom, for example, who's just constantly railing against the inequitable distributions of wealth and the poor treatment of the underclasses by the elites, and this kind of language is just, you find it constantly in the Fathers. It's implicit in the religious orders and the way they distribute goods throughout the community, and the discomfort they have with private property and things of this sort. I mean, it's the infant church after Pentecost. St. Paul's admonitions to Corinth to give to the poor. Whatever you do, don't forget care for the poor. I mean, I don't see how you can fail to find it in the lectionary. Yeah. Now, I will grant to you that as society has become more complex, the moral questions that it has raised over the centuries call for deeper and deeper reflection. I mean, the alternative to that is to just leave huge areas of human life as morally irrelevant. And that seems problematic in a completely different way. I mean, am I going to say that because, say, the Bible doesn't mention, organ transplants, that organ transplants are not morally relevant? Well, of course they're morally relevant. Now, whether they're good or bad, that's something that you have to discern with reason and the consideration of the human person, right?
Sure.
But that's not anticipated in the Bible. I mean, there's 1,000 areas of human life that are not anticipated in sacred scripture read in the liturgy that are nevertheless morally relevant because they can either further or diminish human flourishing and human rationality and human relationship and goodwill. And the Church has historically viewed moral reasoning through the lens of the natural law tradition, meaning that the human person has a definite constitution. People are made up a certain way. Certain things tend to human flourishing, others tend to diminish human flourishing. We have a moral obligation to seek the good of our neighbor, and that means I need to rationally understand what's actually in his best interest. And I can do that through philosophical analysis and come to moral conclusions without the benefit of Scripture if there's no Scripture available, and that's what we call natural law or natural theology. And as economic systems have become more complex, it's necessary for the Church to issue reflection on those economic realities. Now, it was incumbent on the Church. Church had to do this because, particularly in the 19th century, there were people saying, in the interests of social justice, we should eliminate private property and the institution of the family and religion altogether. They were called communists. And this movement was really catching on. And in response to that, Pope Leo XIII inaugurated the modern tradition of Catholic social teaching by saying, you know what? No, the Church has a vested interest in religion, in the family, and in private property. So no to communism, yes to another vision of dignity for the poor and the worker and for social justice.
There it is. Appreciate your call from North Carolina, Lawrence. Thanks for checking in with us. And here is Holly now, a first-time caller from Owensboro, Kentucky, listening on the great Savior Radio Network. Hello, Holly. What's on your mind today?
Hi. I'm wondering about the Church's teaching on giving scandal. So a few calls ago, you spoke to how a caller could effectively avoid giving scandal by clearly communicating his own position and intent and how he feels as a Catholic and what that means for going to his son's baptism in the Protestant church and everything that. And I understand that. I just don't understand maybe would he still be effectively avoiding scandal if other people were to see him going and they don't have that explanation and they don't fully understand what that means and what his intent is? Wouldn't that still be giving scandal?
Sure. So first of all, let's clarify, scandal, of course, is when I cause another person to sin. All right, if I cause another person to sin. Jesus talks about this in Matthew chapter 18. Better to have a millstone hung around your neck and be thrown into the sea than to cause a little one to sin. All right. Now, when I look at this question, I'm asking, well, if I give a Baptist a pass on performing a Baptist baptism, am I causing that Baptist to sin? I don't think so. I don't think a Baptist is sinning when he performs a Baptist rite, right? Now, let's say, a Catholic priest is called upon to perform a non-Catholic rite. Well, that's a totally different animal, right? And the particular case that came up early in the show was a Catholic man who had a Catholic son, and a Catholic son who had left the faith. And should he or should he not attend that baptism? I did not, in fact, say that he would cause the sin of scandal. I said, if you are concerned that you might cause the sin of scandal, you might do this in order to give your conscience some ease. Personally, I think that in that particular instance, the son who's submitting to Protestant baptism as an adult is probably sufficiently far gone from the church that whether the father goes or not is not going to move the needle for that kid one way or the other. Right. I really don't think the father's going to be, personally, I don't think the father's going to be a cause of scandal. Also, I can't possibly anticipate all the ways that people will misinterpret me, nor can I be held responsible for them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, on this show, I do my best to communicate the truth of the Catholic faith. In spite of my best efforts, it occasionally happens that I am, drastically misunderstood. I'll give you a case in point. I have, on occasion, had strong words to say about Martin Luther.
Yes.
All right? Not about Lutherans. Like Lutherans, fine. Got some Lutheran friends, nothing wrong with Lutherans. But even though I make that distinction, it will occasionally happen that Lutherans will call me up and say, why are you attacking Lutherans? And I'm like, I don't remember ever attacking Lutherans. I said some things about Luther one time, but not about Lutherans.
Right.
And I finally realized, you know what? I'm never going to get out of this dilemma. As long as I talk about Luther, I'm going to always have to say, and Lutherans are great people, or otherwise people are going to misinterpret me as attacking Lutherans. It just happens. It's not whatever my intent is. I can't possibly anticipate all the ways in which people could misinterpret my actions, nor am I responsible for that.
Yeah. Appreciate that. Holly, thanks so much for your call. I was just talking with my wife recently about scandal in the year 2025. It seems like the bar changes all the time, and not for the better.
I'm wondering if it's even, I don't even think it's a concept anymore.
Yeah, very sad.
I mean, outside of the Catholic Church.
Very sad. Got an email here from Mexico City from Gustavo, who says, Dr. Anders, I'm a non-Catholic in the process of returning to the church. I'd appreciate your guidance regarding the sacrament of marriage. My wife and I were married in a Baptist church. She is a member of that church. So from the church's perspective, am I considered married? Or should I see myself as someone cohabitating without a valid marriage, meaning I should not approach confession and communion? Thanks for your response. May God bless you and your great team.
Yeah, thanks. So the situation, you've got a formerly Catholic man. He was baptized a Catholic, I think he said?
He says he's in the process of returning to the church.
Okay, so if you were raised Catholic and sacramentalized within the Catholic Church, and then subsequently married in a Protestant worship service, the church would regard your marriage as invalid because you were married without canonical form. As a Catholic, you were obligated to have a Catholic wedding. So what do you do about it? It's very simple, very simple. You have your marriage convalidated. That's it. That's all you have to do. It's easy. You can do it. Call the church up, call the parish. Tell them you want to have your marriage convalidated. You can get it done, Thursday afternoon, if you will. I mean, it's really not a big deal. Now, occasionally, someone will be in your situation, and the Protestant spouse says, well, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. All is not lost. There is a procedure known as ratiocination that will regularize your marriage even without the active participation of your Protestant spouse. So you can regularize this situation very quickly and very easily.
Gustavo, thanks for listening to us in Mexico City. A quick one now from Roseanne. What kind of bread did the church use for consecration and communion before the production of flat wafers? And was there a time when everyone at Mass received the wine or the precious blood?
Right. So the distinction between the unleavened bread used in the Western Church and the leavened bread used in the Eastern Church is very old, very old. I cannot give you the exact date of the division, but it's a very old distinction. And was there ever a time when everyone in the church received communion in both kinds? Well, there are certainly jurisdictions within the church in which people have always received communion in both kinds. But what's normative for us is ecclesiastical law, right? We're not strict primitivists. The goal of our liturgical life is not to find out how someone did it 1900 years ago and then reify that as the only pattern that we can possibly follow. It's rather to stay with the authority of the church that guides us, with our own prudential judgment about how to interpret and live the words of Jesus.
All right. Thanks so much for that question there. And thank you, Dr. David Anders.
Thanks, Tom.
We do this program Monday through Friday here on EWTN, 2 p.m. Eastern Time for our radio program. Check out the podcast by going to EWTN.com/radio, then look for the words Podcast Central. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. We will see you next time. Have a great day and God bless.